Wind swept across the dry plains as the small frontier town stirred awake under a pale golden sunrise. Wooden buildings creaked, horses stamped impatiently, and dust rose in thin spirals along the main road. This was a place where reputations mattered more than truth, where wealth commanded respect, and where silence often hid suffering. The railroad tracks at the edge of town promised escape, yet few dared to take it. In this fragile world lived Selah, a woman whose quiet strength and gentle grace stood in sharp contrast to the harshness surrounding her daily existence in this unforgiving land alone. Selah was 29, known throughout the town not only for her beauty, but for the dignity she carried in every movement. Her eyes reflected patience, her voice never rose in anger, and her kindness extended even to those who did not deserve it. She had been raised in a modest home where honesty and compassion were treasured above all else. When she married into the wealthy Hawthorne ranching family, many believed she had been lifted into fortune, yet few understood the quiet sacrifices she made the moment she stepped into their imposing household with hopes of peace and belonging. The Hawthorne family ruled the surrounding land with authority that bordered on arrogance. The matriarch, Eleanor Hawthorne, possessed a sharp tongue and an unyielding obsession with status, while her husband Thomas valued obedience above fairness. Their son, Daniel, was a man weakened by dependence on his parents' approval, unable or unwilling to challenge them. From the beginning, Selah sensed she had not been welcomed as a daughter but tolerated as an accessory. Every gesture she made was measured, every word quietly judged, and every effort she offered dismissed as insufficient in the eyes of those who controlled her new life. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, yet the tension never softened. Selah rose before dawn to tend to her duties, ensuring the household ran smoothly, but her efforts were rarely acknowledged. Instead, criticism followed her like a shadow. She was told she lacked refinement, that her upbringing showed in the smallest details, and that she failed to uphold the family name. The absence of a child became another weapon against her, whispered first behind closed doors, then spoken aloud without shame, as if her worth could be reduced to a single expectation she could not fulfill at all. Despite the cruelty, Selah endured in silence, believing that patience might one day soften their hearts. She held on to the values she had been raised with, choosing dignity over confrontation and grace over anger. Yet inside, the weight of rejection grew heavier with each passing day. Daniel's silence hurt her most, for he witnessed everything and said nothing. His absence of support carved a deeper wound than any harsh words spoken by his parents. Still, she remained, hoping that loyalty would be enough to secure her place within a family that refused to truly see her for who she was. The breaking point came during a gathering that drew nearly the entire town to the Hawthorne estate. Lanterns lit the yard, laughter filled the air, and tables overflowed with food, yet beneath the celebration lingered a sharp undercurrent. Selah moved carefully among the guests, offering polite smiles and quiet greetings, determined not to draw attention. But Eleanor had other intentions. In the middle of the evening, her voice cut through the crowd, calling Selah forward with a tone that carried both command and contempt, ensuring every eye turned toward her, at once leaving her exposed and vulnerable before them all. Calculated cruelty, Eleanor began listing Selah's supposed failures, each word sharper than the last. She accused her of bringing no value, of failing her duties, and of tarnishing the family's reputation. Murmurs spread through the crowd, some uncomfortable, others quietly agreeing. Selah stood frozen, her hands trembling slightly, her heart pounding in her chest. She searched for Daniel, hoping he might step forward, speak, defend her, but he remained still, his gaze lowered, offering her nothing. In that moment the truth became undeniable. She was utterly alone in a place she had once called home, with no hope left. Humiliation burned through her like fire, yet she did not cry, not there, not before them. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, holding on to the last fragments of her dignity as Eleanor dismissed her with a wave of her hand. The evening continued as though nothing had happened, laughter resuming, music rising again. But for Selah, everything had changed. Something within her had finally broken, not her spirit, but her willingness to endure. The silent endurance that had defined her days could no longer sustain her in a place that thrived on her suffering and quiet pain every single day. That night, under the cover of darkness, Selah made her decision. She moved quietly through the house, gathering only what she needed, careful not to wake anyone. Each step felt heavier than the last, not because she doubted herself, but because she was leaving behind the life she had once hoped to build. When she reached her room, she paused, looking at the traces of her presence, then removed her wedding ring and placed it on the table. It was not an act of anger, but of release, a silent farewell to a bond that had brought her only sorrow. By the time dawn approached, Selah was already walking toward the train station at the edge of town. The air was cold, the horizon pale, and the world felt strangely quiet, as though holding its breath. With each step, she moved farther from the pain that had defined her days, yet closer to an uncertain future she could not yet imagine. The distant tracks stretched before her, promising escape and possibility, but also loneliness and risk. Still, she did not turn back. For the first time in months, her path belonged entirely to her, and that alone gave her strength. The train station stood at the far edge of town, a quiet outpost where hope and departure met beneath a weathered wooden roof. The platform was nearly empty at that early hour, save for a tired station clerk arranging parcels and a stray dog curled beneath a bench. Selah stepped onto the platform slowly, her boots echoing softly against the worn planks. She clutched her small bag tightly, as though it carried not just her belongings, but the fragile pieces of her resolve. The world behind her felt distant already, yet the unknown ahead stirred both fear and quiet anticipation within her. She found a place near the edge of the platform, her eyes drifting toward the long stretch of tracks that disappeared into the horizon. The faint sound of an approaching train had not yet begun, leaving her suspended in a moment that felt both still and heavy. For the first time since leaving the house, doubt crept into her thoughts. What awaited her beyond this town? Where would she go? How would she begin again alone? The questions circled her mind, but she steadied herself, reminding her heart that anything was better than returning to a life where her worth had been denied. A distant sound of footsteps broke the silence. At first, Selah paid little attention, assuming it was the station clerk moving about, but the rhythm was steady, deliberate. Something about it made her turn. Emerging from the soft morning haze was the town sheriff. His presence was unmistakable, tall and composed, his hat casting a shadow across his thoughtful expression. He walked with purpose, yet without urgency, as though he had expected to find her there. Selah's breath caught slightly. She had seen him before, of course, but never like this, approaching her in a moment so private and vulnerable. He stopped a few steps away, removing his hat in a quiet gesture of respect. For a brief moment, neither spoke. The silence between them was not uncomfortable but filled with something unspoken, something that had lingered unnoticed until now. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said gently, though without the formality one might expect. His voice carried warmth, steady and calm, like a presence meant to reassure rather than command. Selah lowered her gaze briefly, unsure how to respond. She had not expected anyone to notice her departure, least of all him, yet here he was, standing between her and the life she was leaving behind. "I didn't think anyone would come," she admitted softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The sheriff studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable but kind. "I had a feeling," he replied. "Some things don't need to be said aloud to be understood." His words lingered in the air, carrying a weight that made her chest tighten. He had seen her, truly seen her, in a way no one else had. It unsettled her, not because it frightened her, but because it stirred emotions she had long kept buried beneath layers of quiet endurance and restraint within her guarded heart. The distant whistle of the train echoed faintly across the plains, a reminder that time was moving forward whether she was ready or not. Selah shifted slightly, glancing once more toward the tracks. "I need to go," she said, though the certainty in her voice had weakened. The sheriff took a small step closer, his gaze steady, his tone unchanged. "And if you do," he began, pausing just long enough to draw her attention back to him, My world will become desolate. The words settled between them, simple yet profound, striking her in a way she had not expected or prepared for at all. Sela looked at him, truly looked this time, searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but found none. His eyes held a quiet honesty, a depth of feeling that made her heart falter. No one had ever spoken to her like that, with such open regard for her presence, as though she mattered in a way that went beyond obligation or expectation. She felt something shift within her, something fragile yet powerful. "Why would you say that?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The sheriff exhaled slowly, as though releasing a truth he had carried for far too long. "Because it's the truth," he said simply. "I've watched you, not in a way that disrespects you, but in a way that admires what you've endured. You carry yourself with more strength than most men I've known. You deserved better than what you were given." His words were not grand or dramatic, yet they carried a sincerity that made them impossible to dismiss. Sela felt her defenses begin to crumble, the walls she had built to survive weakening under the weight of being truly seen and valued for the first time in her life. The train whistle grew louder now, its approach inevitable. Steam could be seen rising faintly in the distance. Sela's heart raced as she stood caught between two paths. "You don't know everything," she said quietly, as though trying to protect him from a truth she believed might change his view of her. Sherif nodded slightly. "No," he admitted, "but I know enough to recognize injustice when I see it, and there's something else you deserve to know." His tone shifted, becoming more serious, carrying the weight of something that would change everything she believed about her situation entirely. "There are things about your husband's family that haven't been spoken openly," he continued. "I've come across information, matters that suggest their accusations against you were never about truth, they were about control." Sela's breath caught as she listened, her mind struggling to grasp what he was saying. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely steady. The sheriff met her gaze firmly. "They needed someone to blame, someone who wouldn't fight back. And you, with your kindness, became the easiest target for their ambitions and their fear of losing power." The realization struck her like a sudden storm. Every harsh word, every accusation, every moment of rejection began to take on a different meaning. It had never been about her failures. It had been a carefully shaped illusion designed to keep her small, to keep her silent. Sela's grip on her bag loosened as the truth settled into her heart. For the first time, she saw clearly. She had not been weak for enduring, but she had been made to believe she was. And now, standing at the edge of leaving, she understood she had never been the problem. The train pulled closer, its rumble filling the air, yet Sela remained still. Her thoughts no longer raced with fear of the unknown, but with a new awareness of herself. The sheriff did not move to rush her decision, nor did he speak again. He simply stood beside her, offering presence without pressure. The choice was hers alone. As the train slowed into the station, Sela took a small step forward, then stopped. She closed her eyes briefly, then turned, not toward the train, but toward the town she had just left behind. Something had changed. The train's whistle faded into the distance, leaving the early morning quiet, heavier than before. Sela remained on the platform for a long moment, her heart pounding, her mind racing with the truth the sheriff had revealed. She looked out over the horizon, where the sun now climbed higher, burning away the remnants of darkness. The choice had been hers, to leave behind all that was familiar, or to confront the injustice and reclaim her dignity. And for the first time in months, she understood what she truly wanted. She did not need escape. She needed justice, clarity, and the freedom to be herself. With deliberate steps, Sela turned back toward town. Each footfall felt lighter than the last, as though releasing her from the weight of humiliation that had clung to her for so long. She passed familiar streets, the dusty paths where she had endured countless stares, whispers, and pointed fingers. The town, which had once seemed so oppressive, now appeared smaller, its buildings no longer towering threats but mere witnesses to her courage. She was no longer the woman defined by fear and submission. She had chosen to return on her own terms. By the time she reached the Hawthorne estate, the house appeared the same, yet everything had changed. Sela entered without hesitation, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. She was met with the usual expressions of surprise and subtle contempt from the household staff, who had long observed her suffering but never interfered. She ignored them, moving through the hall with the grace and certainty of someone who knew the truth of her own worth. Her steps carried her to the main sitting room, where Alina and Thomas were already waiting, perhaps anticipating her return but not the force with which it would arrive. Sela's eyes met Alina's, who attempted the same cold stare that had so often broken her spirit. But today, it faltered. Alina had never seen Sela like this, calm, unwavering, radiating an inner strength that could not be denied. "I have returned," Sela said, her voice steady, "not as someone who will endure your judgment, but as someone who will reveal the truth." Her words were precise, leaving no room for interruption. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but she continued, "The accusations you leveled against me were lies. I have learned that your intentions were never about me, but about controlling appearances and preserving power." For a long moment the room was silent. Daniel, who had watched passively for months, shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the woman he had dismissed was no longer the same person. The sheriff arrived shortly after, not as a threat but as an ally. He carried with him evidence of the false claims, letters and documents that exposed manipulation and deceit. He placed them gently on the table, letting the truth speak louder than any argument. "This," he said, "shows the reality of what has been done here. No one should ever be punished for their kindness or their honesty." Sela's eyes met his, gratitude and trust reflected in her gaze. She had not come alone, and yet it was clear that the power now rested entirely with her. Alina's composure cracked first. Her voice, once sharp and commanding, wavered as she tried to deny the evidence. Thomas looked pale, his authority undermined by the undeniable truth. Daniel, finally seeing his parents' cruelty reflected in the sheriff's calm determination, understood his own complicity. Sela stood firm, no longer the woman who had silently endured, but a force of clarity and courage. The household, long ruled by fear and dominance, now trembled before the quiet power of honesty and integrity. Once the truth was laid bare, the reaction of the town followed swiftly. News traveled quickly through the streets, as whispers turned to conversations and gossip. Sela's name, once associated with shame, began to carry a new resonance. People spoke of her courage, her dignity, and the injustice she had faced. They admired the way she returned to confront the lies rather than flee forever. For the first time, she experienced the support and respect she had been denied. The town, which had once seemed like a cage, now felt like a place where she could exist freely and be valued for who she truly was. Sela's transformation was not merely social but personal. She reclaimed her space within the community, taking small steps to rebuild her life. The household, now devoid of the same control it had once wielded, adapted to her presence on her terms. She engaged with the townspeople, offering guidance, assistance, and friendship. Her reputation became one of integrity, strength, and compassion, a symbol of hope for others who might face similar trials. The very town that had witnessed her humiliation became the setting for her liberation. Through it all, the sheriff remained by her side, not as a savior but as a partner and confidant. He offered support without pressure, understanding that her journey toward healing required both space and patience. Their bond grew naturally, rooted in mutual respect, trust, and admiration. They shared moments of quiet conversation, laughter, and reflection, finding comfort in each other's presence. Sela came to understand that love was not an obligation, nor was it tied to weakness. It was a choice, grounded in honesty and respect, and offered freely to someone who deserved it. The final confrontation with her husband was quiet but definitive. Daniel, confronted by the truth of his parents' manipulations and his own passivity, could no longer claim authority or sympathy. Sela addressed him calmly, stating her decision to leave the marriage, reclaim her autonomy, and live her life independently. There was no bitterness, only clarity and resolution. She had endured long enough, and the life she sought now belonged entirely to her. The sheriff's presence provided reassurance, but the decision came from Sela's own newfound strength. Sela's departure from the Hawthorne estate that day was not an act of escape, but a reclamation of agency. She stepped into the sunlight, feeling the warmth on her face and the wind at her back. Each movement carried the confidence of someone who had faced fear, endured humiliation, and emerged stronger. The town, once oppressive and judgmental, now felt like fertile ground for new beginnings. The railroad tracks she had once approached as a means of flight now symbolized choice, growth, and opportunity. She understood that freedom was not found in leaving, but in standing firm and embracing her power. In the weeks that followed, Sela's life unfolded with purpose and serenity. She engaged with neighbors, helped organize community projects, and began teaching local children. Her presence in the town became a source of inspiration, demonstrating that kindness and strength could coexist, and that dignity was never to be compromised. The sheriff continued to stand beside her, offering companionship, support, and the quiet assurance of someone who valued her presence for the person she truly was. Their relationship blossomed naturally, a union of equals, grounded in love and respect rather than obligation or fear. One afternoon, Sela and the sheriff returned to the train station, not as a place of departure but as a symbol of new beginnings. The sun shone warmly across the tracks, casting long shadows behind them. They stood side by side, hand in hand, watching the distant horizon where the town met the endless plains. "This station will always remind me of a choice," Sela said softly. "The choice to leave or to stay, to endure or to reclaim myself." The sheriff nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "And you chose wisely," he replied. "Your strength became our world's hope, not its despair." In that moment, the past and its pain felt distant, eclipsed by the clarity of present joy. Sela had faced humiliation, exposure, and betrayal, yet she emerged whole, empowered, and ready to embrace a life of dignity and love. The sheriff's presence was not a crutch, but a testament to the truth that trust, patience, and respect could nurture the deepest bonds. Sela had reclaimed herself, and with that reclamation came a freedom more profound than any journey on the train could have offered. The story closed with the warmth of hope and the promise of lasting happiness. The town that had once seemed like a cage became a home. The railroad, a symbol of journeys taken and choices made. And Sela, a woman who had endured everything, now walked forward as a figure of courage, resilience, and grace. The sheriff by her side was both companion and witness, sharing in a love built on honesty, admiration, and mutual respect. And as they stood together, the horizon stretched endlessly before them, bright and full of possibilities, a fitting beginning to a life reclaimed and a heart finally at peace.